The Wii does something that's really interesting, which is it fully encrypts and signs an entire disk image. So you can't touch any single resource file in a game. It uses a hash tree, which is a clever construction, and it effectively signs and verifies the entire thing as you read it from the disk. So you can't change anything. The Wii and the PS3 also have encrypted storage. The hard drive on the PS3 and the flash memory on the Wii are both encrypted with a per console key. And so that way you can't easily read it from the outside and figure out what's going on inside the internal storage memory of the consoles. The Wii, however, also signs that code with an HMAC signature so that you can't patch stuff into that storage, even if you can decrypt it somehow, without knowing a key that's particular to that console that lets you do that. So that's quite interesting too. Quite important too if you have encrypted storage. The 360 does memory encryption, which none of the other consoles do, and it also does memory hashing. So you can't tap a memory bus or glitch something in the protected areas of memory. You can't DMA to them. It basically prevents a whole bunch of hardware-based and the DMA-based memory attacks. And the 360 and the PS3 have a hypervisor, which helps supervise other application code running on them and does some of the security stuff in the hypervisor. The PS3, however, also has user mode and kernel mode. So the PS3 has all three levels, user, kernel, and hypervisor mode, while the 360 only has kernel and hypervisor mode. It does not do user mode. It runs all games in kernel mode. And the Wii runs everything in kernel mode. It doesn't even try to separate stuff on the main CPU. And the 360 has eFuses, which are used to prevent downgrades. It actually blows a fuse inside the CPU when you when you perform some system updates, and you can't reverse that anyway. So once you run an update, there's no way you can downgrade unless you can break the chain of trust before that check happens, which, as far as I know, has not happened so far. So these are the features of the consoles. There's one, however, on the PS3 that's already kind of useless, because it turns out the PS3 encrypts stuff with a key that's the same for every sector and the same IV and doesn't hash anything. So they pulled off this neat trick where you can copy a file into your PS3, like a movie or something. Then you can find those sectors by watching what changed on the drive. Then you take another chunk of the drive, copy it on top, then read the movie back, and it decrypts those sectors that you copied on top for you. So you can do that to decrypt any chunk of the hard drive. And since they don't verify anything, and everything uses the same key and the same IV, it just works. So that encrypted storage is pretty much screwed up to begin with. Okay, so the PS3, however, have other OS, which is a way to run Linux. And as we saw, well, I'm pretty sure it worked as a deterrent because people could already run code, so why break it? But then Sony decided to get rid of it on the PS3 Slim, which is, it's a way of drawing attention. So, yeah. Because now, people are going to start looking at your system, and we know now that there's no technical reason not to have Linux on the PS3 Slim. So it was either marketing or some kind of, boss somewhere said we don't want Linux, or we don't want people running their own code, or we don't know why. But they definitely drew people's attention with this, and now people started trying to hack into the PS3. And GeoHot tried to give it a shot. So you may know that on the Wii, our first exploit was the tweezer attack, which worked by shorting out some RAM address lines and glitching the RAM bus to access areas of memory that we were not supposed to access. GeoHot did something like that on the PS3. He glitched the RAM bus to essentially access areas that you're not supposed to access. So the way this works usually is you have a hypervisor and you have a kernel on the same chunk of memory, but the hypervisor controls the page tables to control memory access permissions for the kernel. So when you allocate some memory from the kernel, the hypervisor gives you a mapping to that memory so that you can access it. And when you remove that chunk of memory, it deletes that mapping and you cannot access it anymore. GeoHot glitched the memory bus right when that write happened, so that even though the hypervisor thinks you have that chunk of memory allocated, in reality it's not actually, it's not freed completely because the kernel has still a page entry that can access it. So the hypervisor thinks that's free memory, but you can still read and write from it, which is bad. And finally, all you have to do is ask the hypervisor to create a new virtual address space, which means create a new page table. And if you're lucky, it ends up in that chunk of RAM. And then suddenly you have access to the page table. You can read and write from it. If you can write to the page table, you can map the hypervisor. If you can map the hypervisor, you can do anything you want in hypervisor mode. So that gets us hypervisor exposure. So this was kind of an academic hack. It worked, and you could do stuff in hypervisor mode, but it required really annoying hardware to pull off. It was really unreliable. And even when you got hypervisor dumps, no one really knew what to do with them. They were kind of there, and whatever. Sony, for some reason, got really annoyed at this because they decided to piss a lot of people off by removing other OS completely from old PS3s. I'm pretty sure that violated some European consumer protection laws and stuff. So, but the worst part of this is that the people who use other OS are the hackers. So by doing this, Sony pissed off the hackers. That's a really, really bad idea. Well, in other words, they are so getting hacked now. So for a while, interestingly, nothing really happened. Obviously, someone was working on this behind the scenes because then we got the PS jailbreak, and then we got a whole ton of clones of it. So the PS jailbreak is a device that lets you run your own code at LV2 kernel level and above, and it uses a clever USB exploit to do that. It's actually a USB device that pretends to be multiple USB devices behind a hub. We'll ignore most of those for now because we got to keep this short, but the important ones are the first one and the fourth owners devices, we call them. The first one just delivers a payload as part of a USB information descriptor into the LV2 kernel. Its sole purpose is to put this payload into memory. It doesn't really do anything once it's there. And then device number 4 gets loaded, and here's where the magic happens. There's some stuff that happened before that, but so device number 4 has several configuration descriptors. The first one is loaded from the device, and that works out fine. It gets put into this blue buffer. And then the second descriptor gets loaded, but something weird happens. The PS jailbreak does an interesting glitch with USB. When you read a descriptor, it has a total length. But to read the descriptor, you need the length. So it's a chicken and egg problem. USB solves this by reading the first 8 or so bytes to begin with. Then you read the length from that. Then you read the whole descriptor again once you know the actual length, and you can request all the data. So the PS jailbreak returns a normal descriptor length the first time around when it reads the first 8 bytes. Then the second time around, it actually returns 0. That forces the USB code to glitch and never actually copy the descriptor out, because now it thinks it's length 0, even though it read it. So the funny thing is, well, LV2 is going to try to parse that descriptor that's not actually there. So it's uninitialized memory. What's actually there is, it turns out that device number 2 was plugged in before and then unplugged, and it sort of initialized that memory for LV2. And it has these 4 funny bytes at the bottom, 04, 21B, 42F. When you parse that as a configuration descriptor, which is what it's going to try to do, it thinks it's a descriptor with length 2FB4, which is really, really long. It's past the buffer. So we've overflowed this buffer, and now it tries to load configuration number 3, and it jumps 2FB4 bytes forward, out the buffer, and into a C++ object array that actually belongs to device number 3. 3. So it puts this configuration descriptor right on top of C++ objects, and it overwrites the vtable of C++ objects to point to the payload. This vtable holds function pointers for things like the destructors and some virtual methods and things like that. So when these objects get destroyed, they actually run our own code. So when device number 3, which has a bunch of crap that created these objects, gets unplugged, we gain LV2 code execution. So this was implemented by the PS jailbreak and then cloned, and there are a whole bunch of implementations of it. The funny thing is, okay, so this works. Why does it work? Why can't we just run code from data memory? This is a solved problem, right? Well, it turns out that LV2 does not do write XOR execute on its kernel. It does not try to protect data from being executed, which is kind of silly because we've had this for a while now. But even more importantly, The hypervisor doesn't know anything about this because the hypervisor will happily map any memory you want as executable. Unlike on the 360, where the hypervisor actually verifies anything mapped as executable, so it can guarantee that any code running has been signed, on the PS3, the hypervisor doesn't even try to do that. It's a hypervisor meant for virtualizing operating systems, not for security. So it's the wrong kind of hypervisor. It really doesn't do what you want it to do for a security system. It just kind of sits there and looks nice and doesn't protect you from these kinds of bugs. So okay, so we have LV2 compromised. We have not compromised the hypervisor, and we have not compromised the secure SPE. So all those are fine. So what happens now? Well, so why on earth can we pirate games by just compromising LV2? Well, it's because the security system makes no sense. So it turns out that you can just copy games to the hard drive, patch LV2 to run them on the hard drive, and LV1 doesn't care, and the secure SPE doesn't care. So you can break 20% of the security and copy games, which is 100% of what Sony doesn't want you to do. So let's go back to our overview of the security features. Obviously, the hypervisor is basically useless because it doesn't prevent you from copying games, so what on earth is it doing? And it's not preventing you from running your own code either, because you can just use an exploit. And to signed executables are also pretty useless because the hypervisor does not enforce them to be signed, to be loaded into memory. You can just ask it for some executable pages, and it just does that. Okay, so Sony fixed this, obviously. And when Sony fixes something, as you might know from the PS3 scene, everyone thinks, okay, let's downgrade. So people started looking into this, and I believe it was the people behind the PS jailbreak who also came up with a way of downgrading. And the way that this works is that Sony has a service mode that they use in their service centers that puts the PS3 into a special mode where it can run some signed code from a USB stick. This service mode is entered by using a USB dongle that does some crypto auth with the PS3, but it turns out it's a symmetric auth. It's HMAC. And since people had broken into the PS3, they found the keys, dumped them, and made their own clone jigs, which is what they call them. And there was a service app that was signed, that was leaked, that lets you reinstall the operating system on a PS3 without any kind of downgrade check. So you just use this jig, then put this on a USB stick, put an upgrade or a system install file on a USB drive, and it just installs that without checking if it's older or newer or anything like that. And since people can downgrade, back to piracy. Okay, so what we did with this whole PS jailbreak thing is we wrote Asbestos, which is a replacement for Game OS. The idea, for other OS, the idea is that, well, since Game OS and other OS really are kind of the same thing with different permissions, the hypervisor interface is the same, you can basically replace level 2 with Linux. So Asbestos takes over level 2, and then you can pretty much just run a Linux kernel, bootload it from a network or something like that, and you can run Linux again, even on a PS3 Slim. It turned out it just worked. There's nothing about the Slim that makes Linux not work. So it was all, the reason why it doesn't support it is because they didn't want to support it. And we also added a feature to it that lets you make your PS3 into a dumb slave that you can control from your PC. And you can use this to experiment with Python scripts, poking the hypervisor, poking the SPEs, reading, writing memory, making hypercalls. Basically, it's a way to experiment with PS3 and especially its security system really, really quickly from a PC environment. Okay.
Yeah. So what have we done so far? So far, we managed to break into level 2 with some jig where we have to plug something into the USB bus, then turn it on, press eject, and then it actually runs your code. But we want more than that. We want like some vulnerability where we can just turn the PS3 on and just boot into Linux for us. So to do that, we need to figure out some more stuff, like how does Sony encrypt their ELFs? So what they do is they build a normal ELF using just some compiler and stick a header on top of that. So this is their crypto header marked in blue and green here. And they have each of those loaders running on the isolated SPUs has some loader key, which can be used to decrypt